So there's no denying that in recent years, the quality of smartphone cameras has shot up a ton. What that means is there's pretty much no barrier to entry if you want to make content anymore. You can do it and it's gonna look great. But does that mean that we don't need to shell out thousands of dollars on professional mirrorless cameras anymore? It's gonna depend on who you are and what you're doing with it. Cameras like this Sony a7 IV are gonna come with a steeper learning curve than using your phone, but you're also gonna have a lot more control over the final image, picture, or video. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some more pros and cons to using your phone's camera versus using a mirrorless or a cinema camera. So the biggest advantage to shooting on your phone is the fact that it's already in your pocket. You don't have to worry about remembering to bring batteries or SD cards. You don't have to deal with the bulk of that extra camera that really never fits into any pocket super cleanly. You already have your phone, and it's probably shooting super high megapixels. It's probably got a couple lenses on it. I think the biggest leap that we've seen with phones recently has been the fact that you can shoot RAW with them. If you don't know what RAW is, it's a file format like JPEG or PNG, but it takes in a lot more information. It's not compressed in any way, so you have a lot more control over the color when you're grading in post. I've been using iPhones since I was a teenager, and the Photos app has come a really long way. They pretty much have a native editing suite inside there now. You also have portrait mode, which does some great artificial separation between your subject and your background. And of course, the fact that you've always been able to just tap on a phone to set your focus and to set your exposure, that's a huge deal. Professional cameras have not had touchscreens up until relatively recently, past couple years. Making the jump from shooting on a phone to shooting on a mirrorless camera used to be kind of a huge pain. Now it's not so much, but the fact that you've always been able to do that on a phone is great. But of course, as great as these devices are, they are pretty limited in a lot of ways. First of all, let's take a look at this sensor, right? Look at the size of that lens. That is a tiny lens, and however big the sensor is, it's gotta be hiding behind that thing. Compare that to the sensor in the a7 IV. The larger a pixel is, the more light it's going to be able to capture and the more information that it's going to be able to take. More pixels does not always mean better image. Another giant pain to these things is that the aperture is fixed. So the aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. The larger the opening, the more light comes through, and also the shallower the depth of field will be. The aperture is measured with a number called an f-stop, and the lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture. Here's what my big fancy Sony lens looks like at f2.8, the lowest aperture, versus f9. And here's that same shot again, taken on an iPhone which has a fixed aperture of 1.9. This is why Apple offers portrait mode. It's a way to fake that bokeh, but it is a software simulation and it's not always going to hold up to scrutiny. You also do not have native control over the shutter speed of your phone. It is worth noting there are third-party apps that will allow you to open up manual, but natively you don't have that control. So pros to using a camera, well again, the larger sensor size is going to make a huge deal, and that is going to mean better low light performance and higher quality overall. A camera like this is also extremely modular. You can rig it up with different flashes, whether that's on the camera or flashes off to the sides. You can bounce light around in different ways. You're also going to have access to a wider variety of lenses with optical zoom. Sean, what's optical zoom? Most phones these days are going to have a couple lenses. Typically you'll see some kind of vanilla 50mm lens, wide angle like a 24, and a telephoto like a 70 that's going to allow you to punch in really nicely. When you pinch to zoom on your phone, it's automatically going to switch to whatever lens needs to get that zoom. So here's the problem. Let's say you see something that's really far away. You've already switched over to the telephoto lens that has the highest zoom. Well, you can keep pinching and you can get closer and closer to the shot, but now you're zooming digitally. And that's basically just cropping the picture before you take the picture. You're losing resolution right and left, and the tighter you go, the lower quality the picture is going to be. With optical zoom, when you twist this back and forth, you're actually manipulating the space between different pieces of glass in here. So you're still going to be using the full sensor and maintain that nice high-res image. The biggest con to using a camera, well, you can't just stick it in your pocket. It's large, it's conspicuous, people are going to notice that you have a camera. All right, so I just switched recording from this camera, which is an FX3, to that camera, which was the A7 IV you saw earlier, so we can talk a little bit more about video. So my favorite thing in recent years about phone cameras is how good the stabilization has gotten. If you want to shoot something that smooth on a mirrorless camera, you need a gimbal, and it's a whole two-handed payload. Look at this, this is huge, and this is for a mirrorless camera, which is tiny. If I had a fancy, large format camera, I would need a whole backpack worth of stabilizers just to keep this thing steady. That sucks. You can also shoot 10-bit color on your phone, which is awesome. Most mirrorless cameras have only recently begun to offer this as an option. Bitrate really just refers to the amount of information that's being taken in. So something like 8-bit color is not going to take in as much information as 10-bit color. You can also shoot great high-res content at a whole bunch of different frame rates. You've been able to shoot 4K 60 for years. Some things that piss me off about phones, well, you can't focus manually, at least not natively. You can use apps like Filmic Pro to open up manual control, but again, that's a whole process. It's like a whole $15 app. You also have a much lower dynamic range on these phones. The iPhone 11 has 10 stops of dynamic range. The FX3 has upwards of 15 stops, and every time you go up a stop, the amount of dynamic range is going to double, so that is actually like a huge amount. Dynamic range basically just refers to how much light or darkness the sensor can perceive before it starts to clip. So if you're shooting indoors with a phone, for example, whatever daylight is coming in through the windows is going to look completely blown out and white. The mics are also terrible on phones. Obviously you could plug something into this lighting port and have some kind of third-party mic, but natively the phone doesn't have anywhere to put that. So you kind of have to buy one of those like handheld rig things, and at that point it's probably larger than a camera anyways. And the biggest pain is that in a lot of run and gun situations, you're not going to have a lot of control over the lighting in a room. So something that I look for in a camera is the ability to perform well in less than ideal circumstances. If you're ever shooting something at night, your footage is probably going to look noisy and disgusting. Pretty much any situation where there's not a lot of light around, you're shit out of luck. So advantages for mirrorless cameras for video. 1, great dynamic range. This also has a bunch of different log profiles built in. Log is basically a format that tells your camera sensor to perceive everything that's coming in as lower saturation and lower contrast than it actually is. That gives you a ton more control in post-production to mess around with the color and the lighting. This sucker also does fantastic in low light conditions. It has an extremely sensitive sensor and really, really big pixels. But obviously, to its detriment, this thing is huge. I mean, I could stick a tinier lens on it, but other than that, you really can't make this smaller. And if you want to stabilize it or stick it on a tripod, the size of this rig is only going to get bigger. You also have to spend a ton of time on set switching between different rigs. So you gotta stick it on this gimbal, and then you gotta balance all the axes out, and half the locks don't even work anymore, and it's just this whole thing just to change the shooting style. The other con is that these are super expensive. The FX3 body costs about, I think, $3,800. The lens was another $2,250. If I want to stick a good microphone on it, that's another $1,000. So it eats into your budget really, really quickly. So phone cameras are great, professional cameras are great. Which one you're using is going to depend entirely on the situation. Phones are great for social media managers and influencers who don't want to have to obsess over every detail of the image and just produce something that looks pretty good really quickly. Cameras are going to be great for professional or enthusiast photographers or videographers who really want that level of total control over their image and are willing to put in a lot more time and effort into both learning and then producing that content. That's all from me. If you got some value out of this video, please hit that like button. It'll help boost it to other people, and consider subscribing for more photography and videography tips.